Okay, so a very quick episode today with just two movies and one album to discuss. So let's get started with Kimo Stamboel's third solo feature that's on Shudder, The Queen of Black Magic. I don't have an awful lot to say about this one, other than to say it was pretty decent. If you're into insanely brutal body horror, this is absolutely one that you're going to adore. If not, you may find yourself wanting to turn it off after the first act, given how boring that first part of the movie is. The plot revolves around a mysterious orphanage that appears to be under the influence of an evil spirit seeking revenge. You've seen this before, I'm sure, a lot of times. And the way the movie floods you with a bunch of characters very early on, introducing them in the most disposable way possible, creates the sense the movie is just presenting you with these characters that it will inevitably kill off later in the movie and serve no greater purpose than that. It's probably my biggest issue with the movie as a whole. When characters die, and there are some crazy deaths, it's hard to care all that much because the movie doesn't treat them with all that much care whatsoever. Of course, that's not a problem if the script can do a lot to compensate, which it only kind of manages to do. It's ponderous and doesn't do a lot to distinguish itself from other haunted house horror films. That's the issue. It's not helped by the fact that all the horror that you see play out on screen is the work of a mostly anonymous supernatural entity who only picks up additional identity at the very end. Apart from the incredibly striking body horror-oriented sequences that do more than enough to keep this movie's head above water, it did feel kind of ploddingly formulaic. Still, at least Shudder is proving that it's at least somewhat worth the investment. More like this and less like Hunted. We might be getting somewhere then. This is a 6 out of 10. Check it out if it seems like your thing. Now onto Netflix's The Dig. It's Simon Stone's third solo feature. This is one of those movies where unfortunately everything about it is kind of impeccable, but the emotionality it was going for did not resonate in the same way with me that I was hoping. It's clearly got its heart in the right place, and that along with some solid performances and mightily impressive production design can make up for a lot. But this story about an excavator who makes a historic discovery probably looks better on paper than what we actually ended up getting. My biggest and most frustrating problem with this movie is to do with how the fundamental concept is just kind of mundane. The discovery that this excavator makes is celebrated as if it's some kind of national triumph, without really giving the audience any details as to why this is the case. Furthermore, the general mundanity means that the dramatic beats don't feel earned or land with the same power and weight that they should, and just feel crowbarred in a desperate attempt to create some kind of drama in what is a thuddingly boring story. It's not that dramatic until the movie needs it to be and the tone suddenly shifts in the most stilted and awkward way possible. There would be almost no stakes to the narrative apart from the vague threats of war that is hinted to try and establish a race against time story element with flimsy and unsatisfying results. If it wasn't for the fact that our main character has a heart condition, which is hinted early on in the film, that could potentially be fatal. It's just an example of the writers writing drama into their film rather than letting the drama develop naturally. In fact, I probably found everything going on around and adjacent to the central narrative more interesting than the central narrative itself. Thematically, the movie has some interesting things to say about the precariousness of existence, and that comes through in how our protagonist Edith interacts with her son as he grapples with the death of his anonymous father, and the responsibility he feels he needs to take in looking after his mother, even as it looks like her days may well be numbered. The movie is actually surprisingly heavy. The unfortunate thing is that the thematic weight that I like is very rarely the main focus and just ends up getting pushed to the side. At least the movie is pretty and the cinematography slightly adventurous. There are a few neatly composed wide shots and a few more unconventionally composed intimate elements to the cinematography that help the movie cultivate its unique tone, but it does so with relative ease despite its occasional clunkiness. It certainly has style, just little to no personality to elevate it any further. It's a decent 6 out of 10. I think I'm going to forget that this exists in record time though. Okay, now onto the sole album that I'll be covering in this episode. Steven Wilson's 6th solo album, The Future Bites. Okay, so I was not planning on reviewing this album, much less having it the sole album in this week's episode, but here we are. Prog rock legend Steven Wilson is back at it with an album about identity in the digital age. Need I remind you that Steven Wilson is 53. Now, this is certainly not a bad thing. After all, it could make for an interesting perspective to explore the digital age from, but I couldn't shake the feeling this kinda had disaster written all over it. I went in with caution and hoped that I would be surprised. But that didn't happen, and instead, The Future Bites ends up it's the kind of fascinating train wreck that had me coming back for more even regardless of that. It's a terrible album that offends me on multiple levels, but also one that comes so close to actually being good, it's kind of infuriating. The production is easily the least objectionable part of this album, reminding me more than a little of that last Tame Impala album, The Slow Rush, and how the melody is usually just glorified background texture, and the production is overall a lot more focused in being pretty than it is actually engaging. The main exceptions to this rule come on the songs where the guitars are allowed to break through and drive a little bit more of that groove, which only really happens on 12 Things I Forgot. Easily the best song on this album by a mile. Elsewhere, well, the blasts of electric guitar and tight bass line on Self are both welcome, as will the distant twinkles of keyboards on King Ghost. We'll get to why I think Personal Shopper pretty much single-handedly derails the album in a bit, but the sharper percussion makes it one of the only songs here with some kind of forward momentum. But even if you can tolerate the indistinct haziness of the production on most of these songs, you still have to sit through that awful vocal synth thing that Wilson's trying to make work. Clearly he deluded himself into thinking that was a good idea on Man of the People. But speaking of Wilson being deluded, the songwriting on this album screams of a writer believing his own hype a little too much. Self has him contemplating how self-obsessed everyone around him is, but his point ends up getting completely lost. Is he trying to make fun of those who are only out for themselves, or is he wallowing in the self-obsessed insecurity himself? Your guess is as good as mine. Honestly, I think that lack of thematic clarity is a mood killer on this album, because what he's actually trying to say becomes diluted into mush. Elemental Sleaze is a song about a shady businessman who sees everybody as someone to prey on and is constantly formulating new ways to do that. But if you wanted to antagonize this person, as Wilson clearly does, given his hatred of consumerist ideologies that bleed across this album, maybe go for a less upbeat and chirpy presentation on the hook, and maybe don't sing the song in the first person. But don't worry, it gets a lot worse. Man of the People is a disgustingly complacent song about just accepting that your life is dictated by a singular person, that man of the people as a reference in the title of the song, and just accepting that the fact that you have nowhere to go and that you have no ambitions either. I must ask, who actually wants to hear this? And then you get to Personal Shopper, a song calling out the aforementioned consumerist ideologies that Wilson resents, and Wilson gets Elton John to list a bunch of non-essential consumerist items, and then layers a spoken word passage over the top of that, repeating phrases like self-indulgence, self-esteem, self-obsession. I can think of many problems with this. Firstly, it's painfully on the nose and reflective of how the entire album is more commentary than it is substantive or interesting. But perhaps more importantly, Wilson is trying to call out people's self-indulgence, completely unaware of how him making an album about it is more revealing of his self-indulgence than anything else. What is he even doing here? Is he criticizing consumers for enabling capitalist systems? And if that's what he's doing, then he's going out of his way to do it in the way that requires the least effort in the writing department possible. And why does he list birth control pills alongside other non-essential consumer goods? That rubs me the wrong way hard. It doesn't show him in a good light whatsoever. Steven Wilson pretty much spends the entire album looking for brownie points for pointing out the bare minimum and doing nothing interesting with it. And nowhere is that more apparent than the very next song, Follower, where he's making fun of mindless social media drama, where people ask for validation for acting privileged and generally just badly. But it's not like he's adding anything new to that conversation, as that kind of behavior online has existed for as long as social media has. And targeting social media in this way on an album like this feels like cheap shots being taken at a cheap target. And while I'm incredibly on the fence about which individual moment on this album offends me most, the closing track, Count of Unease, where he sounds just as confused as I am listening through it, as he questions the stakes of his own album, that probably is up there. He questions whether or not he believes any of the words he said on his album, promptly throwing any kind of drama out of the window. If he's questioning whether or not he cares about the thematic arc of his own album as he does on the song, then why on earth should I? Yeah, it's that bad. But remember when I said that this album was kind of close to being good? Well, this might be an example of an album that succeeds in what it's trying to do a little too well. It's an album about the digital age written by a 53-year-old man, as we've already established, and it reads exactly as you might expect coming from that archetype. It's almost uncanny. I think you could argue that this album is a bit of a masterpiece simply based off that alone. Unfortunately, the album is still completely insufferable, but if you like it, I at least kinda get why. But you'll hear from my opinion, and my opinion is that in a just world, this would be a career killer for Steven Wilson. An utterly pretentious, mindless written slog that if it wasn't for Self and 12 Things I Forgot being legitimately decent songs outside of the context of the album, it would be getting a much lower score. But it's getting a 4 out of 10. Skip this nonsense. So yeah, slightly controversial note to end on perhaps, and nothing that I'm going to remember in the long term. But with Malcolm and Marie here on Netflix, I'm hoping that'll change real soon. I'll see you next time.